Hi, everybody. Randy Nesse here with a talk on why bad feelings are usually normal but useless. It's a part of my project to try to bring an evolutionary foundation to psychiatry. My field is wonderfully efficacious but confused, with arguments continuing about diagnosis and how to find the causes of disorders. Something is missing, and it's pretty clear to me that what's missing is an evolutionary foundation, and that's the purpose of the book on the right-hand side, trying to provide an evolutionary foundation for understanding mental disorders. How bad is it in psychiatry? Well, here's the first page of the leading textbook saying there's little reason to believe that these diagnostic categories are valid. Whoa, after dozens of scientists spend decades trying to come up with categories. And the person who ran the National Institutes of Mental Health for a decade, Thomas Insel, says, whatever we've been doing for 5 decades, it ain't working. Maybe we just need to rethink this whole approach. With no validated biomarkers and too little in the way of novel medical treatments since 1980, it's time to rethink mental disorders. So one root of this confusion I would submit is failure to recognize that negative emotions are adaptations. So why is it? Seems so obvious to those of us in evolutionary psychology and psychiatry. Why can't people recognize it? I think it's simply because it's so obvious that usually they aren't useful. Usually they're harmful. So what's going on here? First of all, the data, overwhelming. You know it already from your own experience with your own life and your friends. Anxiety and depression are just plagues on our species, only exceeding that of alcohol and drug use. Gigantic problems. That's more than half of psychiatry right there. Why are they so common? I mean, Schopenhauer had an answer. He said, if the immediate and direct purpose of our life is not suffering, then our existence is the most ill-adapted to its purpose in the world. Our question for today, however, is why has natural selection left us so vulnerable to excess anxiety and depression? A very simple approach, the standard approach, is to assume that when control systems are intact, you would expect emotions to be useful. If you see a useless or harmful emotion, you assume that it's a product of a defective control system. This is the foundation for most research in psychiatry. It seems to me, however, that both of these assumptions are false. In fact, my thesis is that bad feelings are usually useless or harmful products of intact control systems. Here's a control system with some inputs and a dial and an outputs, as if emotion is always all one thing. That's really too simple. It's tacit creationism. A better model, only slightly better, is to note that there's a situation that gives rise to many cues which are processed to determine if the situation is present in which this emotion would be useful, and dialing up and down different outputs to suit that particular situation. This brings us to an expanded diagram, not just 2 categories, but 5 new ones in which an intact control system can give rise to useless or harmful emotions. The first is the smoke detector principle. In that situation, the system is perfectly normal and it's harmful for the individual now with false alarms, but in the long run, it's good for the individual. The second one is situations where emotions are good for a person's genes, but bad for them. The third is mismatch, giving rise to emotions that are harmful for both the individual and the individual's gene transmission. Fourth is sensitization, systems that natural selection has shaped to adjust the threshold of response depending on the situation. And finally, happenstance sequences that can't be coped with even by an optimal algorithm. Most of you probably know about the smoke detector principle. It's simply that when the presence of a threat is uncertain, you might as well go ahead and express a cheap false alarm because it's cheap compared with the possibility of a gigantic catastrophe. You can set that criterion at different places. Wherever you set it, there will be either more hits and fewer false alarms or vice versa. You can't get something that's perfect. It's just the nature of reality. Here's a calculation you need to do if you want to be fancy about it, looking at the signal to noise ratio and the cost of a false alarm and the cost of not having a response if there is a threat present. But making it simple, think about a lion in the grass. Is that a lion there? Can you see it? If there's no panic and no defense, and it's a lion there, then the cost is 10,000, severe injury. But the cost of having a panic attack is only 100 calories. So it's worth having an attack if there's anything greater than a 1% chance that the lion is actually there. And this means that 99 out of 100 panic attacks will be normal false alarms. Other applications of decision theory have been elaborated and are very useful. One is to do it for continuous responses. Panic is all or none, but pain, fever, and inflammation all tend to be excessive compared with what we think should be optimal, leading to things like cytokine storm and killing people in COVID epidemics because the body's responses tend to be excessive. And then there's applications to cognitive distortions, which often can be very useful. Error management theory, as elaborated by Marty Hazelton and David Buss. Summing up the smoke detector principle, false alarms and excess responses are common and normal, but usually useless or harmful. And that's why in the medical clinic, we can block cough, pain, and fever, and anxiety and low mood safely, except for that one time in 100. And I really wish all doctors could understand the basis of this so they could make better individualized decisions. A second category that explains why emotions might be useless for you is that it's good for their genes. The whole system, of course, is not designed to benefit us. If there's a trade-off between gene transmission and benefits to individuals, gene transmission always wins. People lying in bed for months with unrequited love, not good for them, maybe good for their genes, but not good for them. Likewise, unsatisfied lust gets all kinds of people into all kinds of trouble. And then ambition in general for striving for status. Yes, we all do it and we strive for it and we can't help it, but does it really get you happiness, calm, and a secure, safe, good life? Often it leads to trouble. And then there's worries about our kids. It's a deep truth, I think, that you can only be as happy as your least happy child. And there are good evolutionary reasons why we are so caring about our kids and why we can't stop worrying about them even when there's not much of anything we can do to help them in their current situation. A third reason is mismatch. The mechanisms that regulate emotions are intact, but they're exposed to novel cues. And so you get useless and harmful emotions. All kinds of aspects of modern environments long before smartphones and office cubicles. The wage economy and specialized social roles create all kinds of pressures on people that lead them to not be able to move to other kinds of social roles. Lack of local family is endemic these days. And I can imagine, it's just amazing people can move to a strange city by themselves and settle in and make friends. And it's amazing that we're so flexible, but it's really risky. Then there's inequality, vastly more than a few thousand years ago, and media that make us all see the wealthy and the famous, and it creates unfulfillable desires. Hierarchies are much more rigid and hierarchical than they were before, leaving many people trapped in their middle position or lower position with few alternatives. And finally, getting to an age where you have enough resources to reproduce and raise a family used to be in your teens, and now it's often in your 30s, leading to this long phase of adolescence that graduate students in particular know all too well. What we desperately need here is real data on emotions in non-weird societies. Some people are doing that, but we need real epidemiological data very badly while we can still gather it. Fourth explanation is sensitization. It seems likely that natural selection has shaped systems to increase the sensitivity of systems that get repeatedly aroused. For instance, if you repeatedly are damaging your tissues and arousing pain, that means that proprioception has not been protecting you enough. And so the whole system becomes more sensitive and you get more pain with less input. A perfect setup for a positive feedback loop that creates chronic pain, an idea that I've been very pleased a lot of people have picked up. Same thing exactly happens for anxiety, and for depression. It's been widely known or long known that repeated episodes of depression make it more likely you'll have another one. And so this might not be pathology, as so many people have suggested. It might be part of an adaptive system that's vulnerable to runaway positive feedback. Finally, there are happenstance sequences of events that turn out not to act adequately and accurately represent the nature of your environment. And even an optimal algorithm can lead individuals to do things that aren't optimal for them. One organism doesn't take advantage of opportunities in the environment because 3 times in a row it poked its head out of a burrow and discovered a predator there. Another environment can lead an individual to experience anxiety that also isn't justified by the nature of the environment. Even an optimal mechanism cannot escape the reality of happenstance sequencing leading to positive feedback traps. What's the relative importance of all of these? Well, I think the smoke detector generates a lot of useless emotions. Good for our genes or not for us, that's also very common. Modern environments, very common, but it's very hard to say how common because we don't have adequate data. Sensitization gone awry needs exploration, only occasional, but very important. And finally, happenstance sequences, I think, are also worth serious considering. The overall prevalence of the utility of negative emotions, I think some of the time they're useful for the individual now. Sometimes they're useless from intact mechanisms. Sometimes they're useless because the mechanism just happens to be overly responsive because the individual is at a tail of the distribution for genetic or environmental reasons. And finally, there are people who have mechanisms that really are broken and are not working correctly. And of course, these all combine in actual life. Conclusion, intact regulation mechanisms often generate useless or harmful bad feelings. Terribly important conclusion to help psychiatrists and clinical psychologists recognize that negative emotions can be useful. And in order to understand pathology, we have to look in detail at the person's life situation and at the control mechanisms that are responsible. Thanks very much.